Okay, so David Hume, Scottish philosopher, turned Enlightenment thinking upside down. But
Yeah.
before we get into all that, I want you to imagine this, right? Hume is visiting a friend
Okay.
in their house in Delft,
Uh-huh.
in Holland, and he's expecting, what you think of when you think of a Dutch home, like neat but cozy.
Right, right.
Yeah.
What he finds instead is this, like, spacious, almost starkly empty house, meticulously clean,
Wow.
but no warmth. It's such a contrast to, like, the personality of the homeowner.
It's like walking into a minimalist art exhibit
I
and you're
see.
just waiting for the punchline.
Yeah.
And Hume, he thought it was so bizarre that he wrote about it. And this little anecdote, it might seem random, but it
Yeah.
kind of gets at what we're talking about today.
It goes.
This complex relationship between someone's inner world
Yeah.
and their outer expression.
I think it's a very fitting starting point for our deep dive into David Hume,
Right.
a man of, like,
Yeah.
immense intellect, but who also grappled with this thing he called the disease of the learned.
The disease of the learned. It's like this shadow hanging over his brilliant mind.
It is.
Today, we're looking for clues. Did Hume's struggles with things like melancholy and anxiety somehow
Right.
shape his revolutionary ideas?
To answer that, we kind of have to go back to the beginning. So Hume
Okay.
was born in Scotland in 1711. This was a time of just immense intellectual and political upheaval.
Yeah. Not exactly a quiet, contemplative era.
No.
Europe was buzzing with new ideas, challenging old norms. Do we know anything about his early life that, like, hints at his later skepticism?
Well, his family was fairly well off, landed gentry, but, like, their branch had fallen on slightly harder times, and the sense of, like, being on the outskirts, not quite fitting in,
Yeah.
seemed to have resonated with young David.
It's like the seeds of questioning, of not taking things for granted, were
Yeah.
already there.
Exact.
And he went to university. He went to Edinburgh, right?
He did.
But didn't graduate. That's got to raise some eyebrows.
He didn't just leave. He had what some would call a breakdown. Described it as, like, feeling overwhelmed, even aversion to company and study,
Wow.
which is very much at odds with,
Yeah.
his intellectual passions.
Heavy stuff for someone so young.
Mm.
And this disease of the learned, does he give us any, like, more specifics about what that felt like to him?
He does mention periods of just profound melancholy, loss of appetite,
Oh, wow.
even physical aches and pains. And it's worth noting that this term, disease of the learned,
Okay.
it wasn't uncommon back then.
So not just, like, Hume's personal quirk, but almost like an occupational hazard for deep thinkers?
Yeah.
But was it seen as, like, an actual illness or more like a sign of, I don't know,
Ooh.
overexertion?
The understanding of mental health was just very different then. Melancholy was often linked to, like, temperament, even to an excess of black bile. Like, it literally...
So a bit of a mixed bag of explanations.
Yeah.
But for Hume, this disease wasn't just an abstract concept. It was his reality.
It really was, and he struggled with it throughout his life, seeking various remedies, socializing, traveling, even, like, a brief stint working in, like, a merchant's office.
Trying to find that balance, that
Yeah.
sweet spot where he could pursue intellectual things without
Yeah.
being totally consumed by it.
Totally.
That's relatable, even for us non-geniuses.
It does highlight this tension,
Yeah.
this potential conflict between intense intellectual activity and mental well-being,
Right.
a question that's still debated today.
All right, so we've got this background of Hume's struggles, right? This disease
Yeah.
that seems intertwined with his life.
Right.
But what about his philosophy? Where do these revolutionary ideas start taking shape?
Well, one of his most, like, radical moves was to question the very nature of the self.
Okay.
Something that even now makes
Yeah.
people go, wait, what?
Yeah, the self, I mean, that seems pretty fundamental.
You would think so.
Like we all assume we have one, right?
Yeah.
But Hume is saying,
Not so fast.
not so fast.
Yeah. Okay. He argues that when we, like, introspect, when we look inward, we don't find this, like, solid, unchanging self. Instead, what we experience is this constant stream of perceptions, thoughts, and feelings.
So it's more like a river ever changing
Mhm.
rather than like a fixed statue.
Exactly.
And he's writing this in the 18th century,
Yeah.
long before we had modern psychology and neuroscience.
Yeah.
This is a groundbreaking
It is.
for some like unsettling idea.
Very much so.
And this is where it gets really interesting because we've got Hume,
Yeah.
this man struggling with his own sense of self, with
Yeah.
melancholy and anxiety,
Right.
proposing this radical idea that the self, as we think of it,
Right.
may not even exist.
Yeah. It's almost as if His philosophical ideas are echoing his own, like, internal struggles, right?
Hmm.
Offering this new lens through which to understand the human mind and his own personal experience.
I'm already seeing potential connections here. This skepticism, this questioning of something as fundamental as the self, could it be a reflection of his own anxieties, his own unease with the world?
It's a question worth exploring, and I think to do that, we need to delve deeper into his philosophical system, his empiricism,
Yeah, good.
his skepticism,
Yeah.
and really see how these ideas, born in a time of just like intellectual ferment, might also be intertwined with his personal journey. You know, Hume's skepticism about the self, it wasn't just some like abstract philosophical game. It had real-world implications, especially for how we understand knowledge.
Okay, so how does questioning the self lead to questioning, like, how we know anything at all? That seems like a big jump.
Well, think about it. If there's no fixed self, like no stable observer,
Right.
then how can we be certain about our perceptions of the world? How do we know that we're not constantly being tricked by our senses, by our own biases?
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's like the ground is shifting beneath our feet.
Exactly.
Suddenly, everything feels less certain, less reliable.
Yeah, exactly. And that leads us to Hume's other big idea, empiricism.
Okay.
He argued that all knowledge comes from experience, from what we can observe and test in the world around us.
So not from innate ideas, not from, like, some divine revelation,
Nope.
but from what we gather through our senses.
Precisely. Hume was deeply skeptical of those more traditional sources of knowledge.
Right.
He demanded evidence, proof that could be verified through observation and experimentation.
It's like he's taking a scientific approach to philosophy.
Pretty much so.
Everything must be tested, measured, proven.
Yeah.
But how does this connect to his disease of the learned? Could this obsession with empirical evidence be like a way of coping with his anxieties?
It's a fascinating question. Think about it. If the world feels chaotic,
Yeah.
uncertain, unreliable,
Right.
what better way to kind of ground yourself than by clinging to what you can observe, what you can prove?
Okay, so like creating a framework, a system of knowledge based on solid evidence to counter the inner chaos. But that sounds exhausting, constantly needing proof for everything.
It certainly presents its own challenges, yeah. And this, like, rigorous empiricism led Hume to some pretty radical conclusions, especially about causality. He argued that we can't actually prove that one event causes another.
Wait, what? But that's how we understand the world. Cause and effect.
Right.
I drop my phone, it falls, gravity.
Yeah.
Hume's saying we can't even be sure of that.
He's saying that we observe the sequence of events,
Yeah.
but we can't directly observe the cause itself.
Okay.
We infer the cause based on experience, but we can't be absolutely certain.
Okay, that's a mind bender.
It is.
It's making me question everything,
Yeah.
but I can also see how someone struggling with a sense of instability,
Yeah,
uncertainty, might arrive at this kind of skepticism.
absolutely. Hume's philosophy, it challenges us to, like, confront the limits of our knowledge, to acknowledge that even our most fundamental assumptions about the world might not be as solid as we think.
Right, and this is where it gets really exciting, because we're not just talking about, like, abstract philosophical ideas.
No.
We're talking about a way of seeing the world,
Yeah.
a way of thinking
Right.
that might have been shaped, at least in part, by Hume's own personal struggles.
And those struggles weren't confined to his study. Hume was a very social creature,
Oh,
known for his wit,
yeah.
his love of good company.
Hold on. We're going from radical skepticism to witty dinner parties.
Right.
How did those two sides of Hume coexist?
Well, some might see it as a contradiction, but perhaps it was his way of finding balance, of escaping, like, the weight of his philosophical inquiries.
Or maybe those social interactions, those moments of connection, provided him with a different kind of knowledge,
Yeah.
a different way of understanding the world.
That's a really interesting point. Hume wasn't just, like, a solitary thinker, right? He was engaged with the world,
Yeah.
with people, with
Yeah.
ideas.
Yeah.
And those interactions probably influenced his thinking in ways that we can only imagine.
It also suggests that this disease, however debilitating it was at times, didn't define him.
Right.
He found ways to, like, live a full life,
Yeah.
to pursue his intellectual passions,
Yeah.
while also connecting with others.
It reminds us that even those who grapple with mental health challenges can find joy, fulfillment, and even brilliance in the midst of their struggles.
All right, so we've got Hume, the skeptic, the empiricist, the social butterfly, the man wrestling with his disease of the learned. But how did his ideas land? Did the world embrace this radical thinker?
Well, his first major work, A treatise of human nature
Yeah.
didn't exactly set the world on fire.
Too much skepticism for the 18th century crowd.
It was dense, challenging, and frankly not very well written.
Oh.
Even Hume admitted later that its style was a bit of a disaster.
So genius doesn't always equal good writing. That's comforting to know.
Right.
But he didn't give up, did he?
Not at all. He refined his ideas, published essays, even a massive 6-volume history of England.
Wow.
He found ways to make his thinking accessible to a wider audience.
There's that perseverance again. That drive to keep going even when the going gets tough.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if this disease, this sense of unease, also fueled his ambition.
Yeah.
His desire to, leave his mark on the world.
It's certainly a possibility. After all, many great artists and thinkers have spoken about their struggles, how they fueled their creativity.
Right.
But the question remains, was there something unique about Hume's disease? Something that shaped his philosophical outlook in a particular way?
To answer that, we need to dig deeper into his actual arguments.
Yes.
His specific philosophical claims.
Right.
Let's look at his ideas about morality, for instance.
Oh, yeah.
This is where he really pushes the boundaries of conventional thinking.
Absolutely. Hume argued that morality wasn't based on reason,
Okay.
as many philosophers before him had claimed.
Right.
Instead, he said, morality is grounded in sentiment, in feeling.
So not cold, hard logic, but warm, fuzzy emotions.
It was a radical departure from traditional ethics. He argued that we judge actions as right or wrong based on how they make us feel. We approve of kindness because it evokes a feeling of pleasure.
Right.
We condemn cruelty because it causes us pain.
I can see how that might appeal to someone who's, deeply in touch with their own emotions.
Yeah.
Someone like Hume, who is so acutely aware of his own internal states.
It's a brilliant insight, and it anticipates later developments in psychology and neuroscience that emphasize the role of emotions in moral decision-making.
But it's also a bit unsettling, isn't it? If morality is just a matter of feeling, doesn't that make it subjective?
Right.
Relative?
That's a common criticism of Hume's ethics.
Yeah.
But he argued that while our individual feelings may vary,
Okay.
there are certain basic sentiments, certain shared human responses that form the foundation of morality.
So a sense of empathy, a dislike of suffering, those are universal.
Exactly. He believed that these shared sentiments create a common ground, a basis for moral judgments that transcends individual preferences.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together. We've got Hume's skepticism, his empiricism, his focus on emotions, and his belief in, shared human sentiments.
Right.
It's a complex web of ideas, but it's all starting to make sense.
And as we delve deeper into his work, we'll continue to explore the fascinating connections between his personal struggles, his philosophical insights, and his lasting impact on the world of ideas.
So we've got Hume, the radical thinker.
Yeah.
But what about his views on, politics and society? Was he some sort of 18th century rebel rouser?
Not exactly a rouser, but he definitely wasn't a fan of blind obedience to authority.
Okay.
His skepticism extended to the political realm.
Yeah.
He questioned things like the divine right of kings, the idea that some people are just naturally born to rule.
So a proto-democrat.
Mm.
But remember, this is the Enlightenment. Even revolutionaries were still arguing about, who gets to be in charge.
He was more interested in understanding the foundations of government, why people submit to authority at all.
Mm.
And this goes back to his emphasis on sentiment and human nature.
Okay, so not about abstract rights or lofty ideals, but about, the nitty-gritty of how humans actually behave.
Yeah, he argued that government arises out of necessity. It's a way to manage conflict, protect property, ensure a degree of stability. It's not pretty, but it's how we avoid chaos.
That's a far cry from those who saw government as, some divinely ordained order. Almost sounds like he's anticipating modern political science, looking at the practical functions of power.
And remember, Hume was a historian as well as a philosopher. He'd studied the rise and fall of empires.
Right.
The messy realities of human ambition and conflict.
Yeah.
It's no wonder he took a pragmatic view.
This practicality, does it connect to his personal struggles in any way? It seems, I don't know, at odds with someone who wrestled with such existential anxieties.
It's an interesting question. Perhaps it was his way of making sense of a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable.
Yeah.
By focusing on the observable, the functional aspects of politics,
Right.
he could find some semblance of order.
Or maybe it was a way to reconcile his skepticism about human nature.
Yeah.
With his belief in the possibility of a stable society. After all, if we're all driven by self-interest, how do we avoid constant warfare?
And that's where his emphasis on shared sentiments comes into play.
Okay.
He He argued that even in our pursuit of self-interest, we develop certain rules, certain conventions that allow us to cooperate and coexist.
So a bit like an early version of game theory, figuring out how rational individuals can find ways to cooperate
Right.
even when they're competing.
Exactly. He even wrote about economics, arguing for free trade and limited government intervention, ideas that were quite radical for his time.
Hume the capitalist. Who knew? But it makes sense given his emphasis on individual liberty and his skepticism toward grand schemes imposed from above.
And it's this blend of skepticism and pragmatism that makes Hume so relevant today.
Right.
He challenges us to think critically about our assumptions, about the systems we live in,
Yeah.
but he also reminds us that we're all in this together, trying to make the best of our imperfect human nature.
So wrapping up, we've got Hume the skeptic, the empiricist, the pragmatist, the historian, the social butterfly.
Yeah.
And somewhere in that mix, we've got this disease of the learned, this shadow that seems to follow him throughout his life.
And the question we've been grappling with is, did this shadow, this internal struggle, somehow shape his unique perspective, his revolutionary ideas?
It's a tough one to answer definitively. We can point to connections, parallels between his personal experiences and his philosophical claims.
Right.
But ultimately, it remains a mystery.
But that mystery, I think, is part of what makes Hume so fascinating. He reminds us that even the greatest minds are not immune to the complexities of the human experience, to the struggles and anxieties that we all face.
And maybe, just maybe, those struggles, those moments of doubt and uncertainty are not a sign of weakness, but a source of strength, a catalyst for, deeper understanding.
After all, it was Hume who said, "The only way to erect a common and uniform standard of right and wrong is to appeal to the common sentiments of mankind." And perhaps it was his own journey, his own wrestling with the disease of the learned, that allowed him to see those common sentiments with such clarity.
So, dear listeners, we leave you with this provocation. As you delve into the world of David Hume, as you encounter his brilliant and often challenging ideas, remember that behind those ideas was a human being grappling with his own inner world, just like you and me.
And perhaps in that shared human experience, in those moments of vulnerability and insight, we can find the key to unlocking not only the mysteries of Hume's philosophy, but also the deeper truths about ourselves and our place in the world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the life and mind of David Hume. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep embracing the beautiful complexity of the human experience.